Welcome to Wine Soundtrack USA. Listen to the passion with which producers narrate their winery and their world in 30 answers. Discover their stories, personalities, and passions.
Hello, friends and listeners of Wine Soundtrack. This is Allison Levine, and today I'm sitting in the lovely tasting room of Iris Vineyards in Eugene, Oregon. I'm sitting with winemaker Aaron Lieberman. Welcome, Aaron, and tell us a little bit about Iris Vineyards.
Well, so Iris Vineyards, we began planting in 1996, and the first wines came out in 2001. I began working at Iris in 2008 when they first built their own winery. So prior to 2008, all of the wines were made by other wineries in the Eugene area on contract. So let's see, for going on 12 vintages, I've been the winemaker here, and I'd like to think that we've done a pretty good job of improving wine quality. And since 2008, we've also improved our distribution and our direct-to-consumer sales, and we're on the cusp of becoming well-known, it seems like.
Yeah, well, for those of us who are not familiar with Iris Vineyards yet, tell me, I know to get up here, I drove down up a long driveway and wrapped around these beautiful vineyards. How large is this estate, and how much do you have planted, and what do you have planted here?
Yeah, so the estate is 870 acres. Most of it is forest and pasture. We have about 43 acres planted right now. You probably noticed coming in that we have some newly cleared areas with some rather ugly slash piles out there right now. But once we get those cleaned up, we'll begin planting the areas that you saw, starting with about 6.5 acres of vines in spring of 2020. So that will be 3 acres of Pinot Gris to add to the 9 acres we already have. Also 2 acres of Pinot Noir. So that would bring us to, I think, about 32 acres of Pinot Noir. And we're also, for the first time, putting in 3/4 of an acre of Pinot Blanc and 3/4 of an acre of Pinot Meunier. So we actually have a new program at Iris in making sparkling wines. So both of those new varietals are approved varietals for champagne. Obviously, we're not making champagne here. We have to call it sparkling wine. But we do try to make it in a very traditional way and in the traditional methods. So we'd like to have those 2 varieties to add to that program or make some still wines out of that. I think it would be interesting for our customers here, tasting room, to have a Pinot Blanc or a Pinot Meunier to taste alongside the lineup that we already have.
And what does that lineup include? How many wines? And what's your total case production?
So we're at about 12,000 cases right now. We're edging toward 15,000 this fall in production. And primarily we bottle a Willamette Valley Pinot Gris and a Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, each of which is around 5,000 cases. And then the balance of that production, mostly wines that are not in distribution, with the exception of our estate Rosé, a Pinot Noir, and estate Chardonnay. And so Rosé, we're just under 1,000 cases, and the Chardonnay, we're 400 or 500 in any given year. And then our other wines, we source the grapes mostly from the Rogue Valley. So we're doing some Syrah, some Viognier, some Tempranillo. We have done in the past a varietal Cabernet Franc and Merlot. And so now we're going to blend those wines and make a Meritage blend that we hope to get into distribution as well.
Quite a range of wines. So tell me, what is your first memory relevant to wine?
So when I was a kid, on special occasions, my parents would bring out sparkling wine and allow the kids to have a taste only around dinner time, for whether it was Christmas or New Year's or somebody's birthday. And so that's my first memory of wine.
And when you were a little more sophisticated and knew what you were drinking, what would you say is one of the most memorable wines you've ever drunk, and what was the occasion?
Yeah, I do get that question quite a bit, and I always go back to when soon after my father and I had a little private label that we started in 2002, and soon after we did that, we had a dinner at Ringside Steakhouse in Portland, and I ordered a bottle of Pellini Montrachet, and I remember that wine well. A lot of people have strong opinions about Chardonnay, and I do as well, and I think that experience with that wine kind of changed my opinion about Chardonnay and what that grape is capable of. And so we actually we have a climate here at Iris Vineyards that allows us to make a much leaner, more acid-driven Chardonnay than most people are used to, and it much more closely reflects what you might find when you open a bottle of Chablis or white Burgundy than it does, a Napa or Sonoma Chardonnay. So, people have different tastes for Chardonnay, and some people like the California Chardonnays. I tend to prefer the ones that we make here and the ones that they make in Burgundy and Chablis. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, so we're looking at, so we make it in that style, and it's still a tough sell. Chardonnay is, because people aren't used to it coming from Oregon. So we have some more work to do in terms of marketing that kind of wine, but we're getting there.
So if we were to come to your home and enter your wine cellar, whatever that may be, however large it may be, or maybe you store things here at the winery, what would we find in your cellar?
So I have a few. I have mostly wines that I've made. And a few other things. I'll keep some other sparkling wines around from other primarily Oregon producers. And, I love Oregon Pinot Noir, obviously, and you would find some wines from some other Oregon producers in there.
So pretty localized.
Yes.
So you work with Pinot Noir, you work with Pinot Gris, and some other varieties. Do you think there's a such thing as a perfect variety?
Perfect in terms of taste?
However you interpret that. Perfect to work with, perfect to grow, perfect to make, perfect to drink?
I would have to say no. I think each varietal in any terms has its pluses and minuses. So whether you're talking about growing the grape or making it into wine or drinking it, there's always going to be things that are positive about the varietal and things that are not so positive. And clearly, when it comes to drinking, it's a matter of preference. And so I would never pretend to tell somebody, a consumer, that they ought to like a particular wine just because I think it's perfect.
When it comes to letting a grape speak for itself or a wine speak for itself, how do you approach that with food pairing? Do you have any rules that you follow or any sort of things that you're looking for when you're creating a meal? Yeah,
I don't actually deviate much from what people consider to be the rules. And that's not to say that I'm dogmatic in any way about that. I will often have Pinot Gris with salmon instead of Pinot Noir.
Oh my God.
But generally speaking, I think if you have some flavor memory with regard to the wines and with regard to the food, then pairing is not that difficult. You just have to give it a little bit of thought and say, I had Merlot last week, and I know that Merlot tastes a certain way, and maybe it's not going to go with this whitefish that I'm making tonight. I probably want to think about something else.
So you're making wine, and obviously there's a very competitive market out there. How do you feel about wine critics and scores?
I think the thing to remember when it comes to wine critics, particularly when you're talking about a magazine, say, where the score that you get is based on one individual tasting that wine, that each individual has different tastes, and that person could have a good day or a bad day relative to their palate when they're tasting a wine. So I think it's when you read those kinds of magazines and you're looking at a score, whether it's an 88 or a 95, it's important to keep that in mind, that you don't know how that person was feeling that day. You might have an idea of what their palate is like if you read them consistently and understand whether what they like reflects what you like. So that's kind of how I look at that. When it comes to things like, say, San Francisco Chronicle wine competition, where you have a panel of judges, I consider those kinds of things to be more reliable indicators of wine quality than a score.
Yeah, so there's a place for elements of it.
Right.
So when you're your own critic, what's your choice, red, white, or rosé?
Well, it's hard to choose just one wine, and so I'm not going to do that. But I really enjoy in the springtime and in the summer really a well-made rosé, no matter what the varietal is, and also well-made white wines can be amazing in the summer with food, and also in the winter with the right food pairing. Mm-hmm. But typically, you would find me drinking a red wine.
Still or sparkling?
And red?
In anything, still or sparkling wine would you pick?
Boy, if I know the wines and I know they're both of good quality, I would probably pick the sparkling.
And would that be a champagne until you're making your own?
Well, we are making our own.
Oh, yeah, already?
Here.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we started in 2015. So we'll be releasing our 2017 Blanc de Blanc in November.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. There's a lot of variety in champagne. I tend to like a more fresh style than like the super extended tirage wines or the wines that have spent a lot of time in barrel. So, a lot of the champagne producers have a base that they keep from year to year. And so I think over the years that the taste of the winemaker can migrate more and more toward that base, and where it's kind of, for my palate, a little too oxidized. Mm-hmm. So those, I don't really like those wines. I like the more fresh style.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the vineyard and time in the vineyard. You've got 40 plus acres here, spending time in the vineyards. Do you see a big variation from vintage to vintage? And how much of a variation do you see? Or how much commonality do you see from one year to another?
Yeah, there's a lot of variation from vintage to vintage. I actually started my career in vineyard management development back in '96 at Amity Vineyards, and I did that for 5 years before I started making wine in 2001. And I think, like most winemakers, I have a vintage memory. So if you ask me about 2008, I can tell you, what the wine was like and kind of what the weather was like that year. And so we definitely get cool years. We'll get years where we have rainy falls, years where we have, here in particular, frost in the spring that influences our bud break date and consequently our bloom date and our harvest date. So when we do have frost and the harvest date gets pushed back, then we can often struggle with getting the fruit ripe before the rains really set in. Mm-hmm. However, I think that some of those years that seem difficult can produce some of the best wines. And again, that goes to taste. So in those cooler years or years that are frost affected, we tend to make a Pinot Noir that's quite a bit leaner, lower in color saturation. But for me, it's very expressive on the palate, and the aromas can be, very, very fresh and fruit forward in terms of red fruits like strawberry and rhubarb and red cherry kinds of flavors. And if a consumer likes that kind of Pinot Noir, then it would behoove them to understand the vintage that they're looking at. So, somebody who wants that kind of wine, for example, would probably not want to buy a 2016 Pinot Noir. They'd want to look at 15 and 17.
Which were cooler years.
Yes.
Okay. Do you have any signs or omens you look for that will help predict what a vintage is going to be like?
The biggest thing is the weather, and whether we've had frost or not. And clearly going out in the vineyard and looking around at the vines and whether there's any disease problems or insect problems or a light crop or a heavy crop, those are all good indicators of how the vintage is going to be. A really important thing, I think, for Pinot Noir is the weather during bloom. So if you have good weather, you get good pollination. Grapes are self-pollinating. And so if you have a good pollination rate, you can end up with a higher number of seeds per berry. So say 3 to 4 seeds, 4 being the most that you can have in a typical grape. That leads to a bigger berry. And so you have more juice and pulp and less skin as a ratio. So that's going to lead to a wine that, again, has less color saturation, less phenolic content. It's going to be less bitter or tannic on the palate. And so that goes back to that whole preference thing. Do you like that kind of wine, or do you like something that's more concentrated?
Wine Soundtrack, the voice of American wine growers and makers.
So you were saying before you go into the vineyard, obviously you spend a lot of time in there and you're looking to see what's happening throughout the season. Have you been known to talk to the vines while you're out there walking through them? And if so, what do you say to them?
No, I don't talk to the vines.
Do you talk to the wine or play music for it when it's in the winery?
I have not done that. It's an interesting idea, playing music in the cellar. And we do play music during harvest, but it's for our ears, not for the barrels of wine necessarily. And that it's rumors fly about that kind of thing, and I don't put much credence in that.
Fair enough that you don't ascribe to any of those sort of holistic beliefs. But tell me if you have any rituals at the start of harvest for you yourself or for you and your team. Any sort of traditions or rituals at the beginning or during or post-harvest that you can tell us?
Well, our Chardonnay vines are just as old as the rest of our vineyard, mostly planted in 96. When I did my first vintage here in 2008, we made Chardonnay. And then because of the market, we didn't bottle it. And we didn't make it again until 2012. So we had this small tank of Chardonnay sitting around since 2008. And so that sort of became a tradition at the beginning of harvest, is everyone had to drink a bunch of the Chardonnay before harvest got started.
Was that a good thing or a torturous thing?
Well, it probably depends who you ask. The wine aged remarkably well in tank.
And have you drunk it all now, or do you still have some left?
It's all gone.
So any new traditions?
Nothing terribly out of the ordinary. We have a harvest party each year, hopefully before harvest. And we always bottle right before harvest, the previous vintage. So This year it's going to be the first week of September. And so I guess that's kind of a tradition.
Sets everything in motion.
Yeah.
So Aaron, when you were a little boy, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, like most little boys, I thought about being a fireman or a policeman or something like that. When I actually became serious about career going into college, I wanted to be a veterinarian. And I went to Oregon State University. And being in the College of Agriculture, I had to take other classes. I couldn't just take the animal science classes and the animal nutrition classes. I had to take classes about grass seed and small grains and soil science. So I fell in love with soil science, changed my major, and I worked with a number of professors and grad students who were very excited about the wine industry at the time and the connection that wine has to soil. So apart from the influence that my father had on me with regard to my love of wine, those professors and grad students had a big influence on me as well.
Wow. And so you've obviously followed a great path in vineyard management into winemaking. When you're not working, how do you spend your free time?
Well, right now, I just bought a house a few months ago that needs a lot of help. So that's where all my spare time is going right now. And
do you do any sports? I know Oregon is a big outdoors area. Do you partake in any of that?
Sure. I do some hunting and hiking and fishing, mainly crabbing.
Crabbing?
Yeah. I have a friend with a boat, and so we go to out the mouth of the Umpqua River and crab out there. And I don't really do any outdoor sports per se. I used to compete in weightlifting a few years ago, and then had to have shoulder surgery. So, so that ended that pretty quickly. But I still love getting to the gym and doing some working out.
So you've worked in the business for a little while now, and you said you were talking about some of the great mentors you had and people that you've trained with. What would you say is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Oh, wow. I guess I would have to say, and I don't remember who first said it to me, but a number of people have, is to make sure that you continue to drink a variety of wines that are not of your own making. And like I was saying before about some of those champagne houses that make those really oxidized champagnes, I think if you get too wrapped up in your own little world and your own cellar, then you can start to lose sight of what quality wine really is.
Mm-hmm. And if you could offer some advice to our listeners today, what kind of advice would you like to share?
Consumer listeners, drink what you love. Don't buy stuff just because it's cheap. I think, who said that? I don't know if it was Jefferson or Franklin. Life is too short to drink bad wine, or bad beer.
Or bad anything.
So, definitely, if you find a $5 bottle of wine and you love it, by all means, drink that. I think those are rare. But I think it's important for consumers to have variety in their lives when it comes to wine as well. And, don't just run out and buy the same wine every time. Shop around. So looking back at your work to date, what would you say is one of your proudest achievements? Well, certainly becoming the winemaker here at Iris Vineyards. It's my first head winemaking job. and only, obviously. I haven't moved on. So that was a great achievement for me. And I think that we've continued to improve over the last 11 vintages, going on 12. Just in the last year, a little over a year, I've added a couple of people to my team, people who have worked for me before, just for vintage, and they're both amazing, and I'm excited more than ever about what we can do in the cellar and the kinds of quality wines that we can turn out.
That's great. So complete this sentence for me. A table without wine is like?
A table without wine is like shoes without socks.
Huh. There's uncomfortable, yes. You've been talking about how proud you are with where the winery has gone and with the wines that you're making. If there was one person that you would want to be tasting your wine, to be drinking your wine, if someone was sitting in a restaurant and the paparazzi caught a photo of them and there was a bottle of your wine sitting on the table with them in the back of that photo, who would you want that person to be drinking your wine?
I'd have to say that I'm proud to see anyone drinking my wine. The particular celebrity or political figure doesn't really carry that much weight with me. It's more about the everyday consumer.
So any of us can have a bottle of your wine and that'll make you happy.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Do you think, knowing we go with climate change and you were talking about the frost and different things that we go through all the time, where do you think we'll be in a couple hundred years? Do you think we'll still be making wine, drinking wine? What do you think the landscape might look like in 300 to 500 years?
That is terribly hard to predict. We have so much opportunity right now to influence that landscape, or what it will look like in that time frame. I do think that we need to act quickly to have an impact, a positive impact. So whether we act or not is going to be important to that. I'm not a climate scientist, so I'm not going to pretend to sit here and tell you that if we don't act, that in 500 years we'll wipe ourselves off the face of the planet or something like that. Humans are quite resilient, so we'll just have to wait and see, I guess.
And hopefully we'll be drinking.
Yeah.
So should we get close to wiping ourselves off this earth and you're sent to a deserted island, what 3 wines would you take with you?
Pinot Noir, and Pinot Noir.
From where, and where?
They'd probably all be from Oregon.
Oh.
Yeah.
And anything else you would drink? No, just Pinot Noir. Yeah. In one form, not sparkling, not rosé, just Pinot. Well, we play a little game with Wine Soundtrack where we talk about wine and music because, so often, as you said, you listen to music when you're working in the winery, and music plays such a part in our lives, and wine sometimes makes us think of music or vice versa. So you can tell me a genre, you can tell me a specific song, you can tell me a musician, but what would you want to listen to drinking your estate Pinot Noir?
Yeah, so I grew up listening to my parents' music in the 70s and 80s, and I came of age in the 80s. So my personal soundtrack is still heavily influenced by those years.
I feel your pain.
And so I would be listening to probably 80s pop.
Okay. And what about your Pinot Blanc sparkling wine?
Sparkling wine, Boy, that feels so much more classical, doesn't it?
Very classic to be classical, I
Yeah.
guess. And your Pinot Gris.
Pinot Gris, it's a more lively, jazzy wine, I think. So that could be appropriate.
Okay. Well, you did very well. Thank you. So before we go, just one more quick question. Exploring the world of wine, you obviously enjoy drinking the wines of the region and of your friends and your neighbors. Where's one place around the world, anywhere, that's at the top of your list that you want to go explore?
I've been to Spain and Italy and France. I've only been to Spain once, and that was in 97. I would love to go back there. I think there's a lot going on there. A lot of people don't know that it's like number 2 or 3 in wine production in the world. I don't remember the exact number, but it's right up there. And I know that the quality of the wines there has changed over the years, and there's this kind of traditional wine flavor profile that people associate with Spain from years past, and it's not necessarily true anymore. So I think it would really be fun to revisit that and re-explore the wine region in Spain.
Great. You can never visit one region enough times. There's always, you can come back to a place over and over, and there's always so much more to see. So speaking of that, people should come up here for sure. Tell our listeners, where can they find Iris Vineyards? Can they come visit you? Where can they find their wines and find you? And
the best place is right here at our tasting room. We have all of our wines available here. In distribution, we have the Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, Willamette Valley Pinot Gris, the Rosé, the Chardonnay, and we're working on getting this Meritage style blend into distribution soon. And we're in about 20 states now. We just got into California, so you'll be able to find us mainly in the Bay Area and the Los Angeles area in some stores there. In Eugene, we're in a couple of different wine shops and stores in town as well. We have fairly strong distribution in Oregon, so reasonably well represented in Portland.
And you just have to look for the really cool label, because Iris, it's a label of an I with the ris. What's the story behind the name?
So originally the winery was called Iris Hill, and the reason for that was when the owners, Pamela and Richard, bought the property, this hill where the vineyard now sits had recently been logged. And one of the things that happens in certain parts of Oregon, this being one of them, is when the area is logged, the wild irises pop up in great numbers. And so when they came out here, they said, "Oh, look, Iris Hill." So that was the name of the winery. For some time in 2007, it was changed to Iris Vineyards, and the person who was managing the winery at the time had hired a graphic artist, label designer to come up with a new concept for the label, and that's where the I came from.
Well, we're going to keep our eye on you.
Right.
We thank you for joining us today, and we'll remember that we fly into Eugene in the southern part of the Willamette Valley if we want to visit Iris Vineyards, and we will look for your wines around town, around the markets. But thank you, Aaron, so much for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to a new episode of Wine Soundtrack USA. For details and updates, visit our website, winesoundtrack.com.